Oh, there we go. Finally, we're live. Hello, everyone. It took a while to launch. Welcome to this episode of In Lay Terms. I'm your host, Payman Asghari, and we have back again this week Professor Salim Mansur. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much, Payman. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming back 2 weeks in a row. I know you have a busy schedule, and I appreciate it, sir.
Pleasure.
So since last week we kind of focused on a little bit on Israel, but Canada's role in peacekeeping. And we got to talking and we said, what about talking about some things that aren't being talked in the parliament right now, which is the changes in the world from a unipolar to a multipolar world, de-dollarization and BRICS, Canada's role in NATO with Carney suggesting that we should move more to the EU. And also you have an interest in the rise of the global South, and you believe that we're not really addressing this. You ran for the People's Party in 2019. I ran in 2025 in this election for the People's Party, and the discussions that are being had by the average voter, they're very municipal. They're very local. What are you going to do about the reflective coloring on the highway roads? What are you going to do about garbage collection? But I thought maybe today, and with your help, we could actually tackle this more geopolitical issue. So I'll hand it over to you with that.
No, don't hand it over to me. We should have a conversation. But yeah, what you've just outlined is in so many different ways one of the, if not the most important subject matter, an urgent subject matter topic that needs to be widely discussed among Canadians, among North Americans, but definitely Canadians from coast to coast. And it is not happening. And what I mean by the topic, as you just outlined, is the World Economic Forum, just before the COVID scam hit us, we're talking about the Great Reset, if you recall. Well, in my view, we are in the midst of the Great Transition. Right now, as we speak, you and I, we speak, there are two major wars going on, one in Ukraine and one in West Asia. And then there are other wars that are going on, conflicts that are going on, in which the Western powers are involved directly or indirectly, as in sub-Saharan Africa, Sahel, Congo. And all of these together is part of what I would call, at this time in history that we are living through, the era of the great chaos. In other words, the chaos in world politics that we are faced with, both in terms of kinetic warfare, as in Ukraine, in Gaza, the recent events that we saw, witness, the bombing of Iran, which we might want to talk about, just as we need to talk a little bit about Ukraine, the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, Canada's role in it, the role of the international institution, whether they are playing any role or what has happened to them, that is the UN system, and where are we headed in the world, because we are headed in the world into a fundamental breakdown. And I would call it positive, but it's a breakdown of the post 1945, that is the post Second World War world order that was created at the end of that war, um, which then became a bipolar world, one divided between the East and the West calling itself the free world, led by the United States, and the East being called the communist socialist bloc of countries, led by the Soviet Union. And the world became bipolar, that is divided into two. And that world transited or transformed after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 92, into a unipolar world, under the hegemony of the United States. And then that world started breaking down, and we are in the midst of this era of chaos I'm mentioning, breaking down um, over the past 10, 12 years. Uh, in terms of the critical breakdown, was the beginning of the proxy war in Ukraine that followed the coup d'etat that took place in 2014 in Ukraine, in Kiev, when the Western powers, led by the United States and the EU countries, uh, organized a coup d'etat or supported a coup d'etat that overthrew an elected president of Ukraine, President Yanukovych, and installed a pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-American President Poroshenko, who was then replaced by the current president, whose term of office has expired, but he's still hanging on to power with martial law, that is President Zelensky. So that is one side of the story. And the other side of the story is the breakout of the war in West Asia, beginning with the genocide in Palestine and Gaza by the Israelis. And that has rapidly moved on to a deep confrontation that occurred last month in June, um, in which the United States and Israel together um, operated in the bombing, the Israelis in the effort of decapitating the Iranian government, the Iranian state, the Islamic Republic of Iran, by killing the top leaders and commanders of the Iranian Republican Guard Corps and something like half a dozen or more leading nuclear scientists um, with their families, in a decapitation.
Professor Mansour, if I can, I just wanted
Yeah,
to point something out. This isn't really related to what you're talking about, but the killing of those officials, that's terrorism. Like, this is no longer a war. That's an assassination of civilians. They killed the leaders and their wives and their children and anybody that was in the vicinity.
that's
And they did it in a way that it's almost like a Hollywood movie. You find them out from space and then you hit them with a, maybe not a space-based weapon, but a drone strike or something.
yeah, you're absolutely right. And it was not the first time that they did it. They have done it, during the inauguration of President Pezeshkian uh, last year, when the state guest of Iran was killed, that is Ismail Haniyeh of the Hamas in Gaza, who was in Tehran. It was done in the bombing, targeted bombing of civilian building in which um, Syed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, was. Now, if Iran or any of the other countries who have faced this sort of onslaught, and this is most recent, Iranian scientists have been killed before. If the Iranians would be doing the same thing, because they can also target directly, there would be a hue and cry in the Western world. They could easily, as they had demonstrated, drop their hypersonic missile on the Knesset building and taken out the entire membership of the Knesset. You know, these are all targeted strikes, and they could have done that. They could have bombed the other government buildings. They could have targeted Benjamin Netanyahu's residence. We're living in a different time and space in modern warfare. The GPS, the satellite targeting could have been done, but they haven't done that. So yes, But the point I was making is that these are the two wars that is going on, and the others that are not reported in the Western media, that is in Africa. For instance, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mauritania, Chad, in particular in Burkina Faso, where the president of Burkina Faso and the government of Burkina Faso has basically thrown out the French because Sahel, sub-Saharan Africa, was part of the French colonies, and still the French are dominant over there from Senegal and the whole Sahel region, whereas in North Africa, the French were expelled. That was more than 50 years ago. I'm referring to the war in Algeria, which was a very bloody war. So all of this is happening, and the question is the timing and why, and how did it come about, and that to unravel is a very complex issue. But very quickly, I will say, won't get into it, just laid the marker, and then we can talk about it. That the unipolar world that emerged in 1991-92 with American dominance and hegemony became a world in which we saw that the Americans proceeded to unilaterally dictate the terms of international politics based upon the idea of rule-based order, not the UN system, not international law. And the most uh, eminent example of that was the destruction of Iraq in 2003 on the basis that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which was proven to be a lie because the UN and the International Atomic Energy Association and the UN mission to Iraq to oversee the dismantlement of any weapon system, biological, nuclear, chemical, that Iraq possessed or might have possessed, or where there were signs that they were engaged in trying to acquire them, were all dismantled. I mean, Scott Ritter, the U.S. Marine Corps officer, major, who is around, who is speaking on these matters, was the signatory or who led the mission of the UN, deputed by or nominated by the United States, saw that the Iraq basically gave up all of its vessels. That is, Saddam Hussein gave up all of his vessels in the
Professor
period.
Mansour,
Yeah,
just quickly for the audience, can you distinguish what's the difference between rule of law and rules-based order?
very good question. Rule-based order concept emerged in this period. That is, the Americans and America's allies in the European Union, backed up by the force that America has on hand, sort of a coalition of partners in NATO, North American Treaty Organization, of which Canada is a member, would be establishing norms, behavior, conduct, and would be investigating whether any of the countries are breaking those norms, rules, this rule based also breaking them, and then there would be penalty for that. So this is the unilateral statement of what is happening. For instance, there's many sanctions America has put upon countries that America has targeted, like Iran, for instance, like Russia after the 2014 coup d'etat. Uh, so these sanctions have not come through the United Nations. That's the international body. That's the forum. And the UN represents international law. A law is established through treaties, through covenants by the international bodies and the member states of those international bodies They're engaged in the discussion of those treaties, those covenants, those conventions, engage in that, and then they vote upon it in the international body, which is the United Nations Forum. And then they're adopted, and then they become signatories. So, for instance, the Geneva Conventions on the rules of how and the war should be waged, or must be waged, what are, rights and wrongs, and so on and so forth, is international law that was discussed and passed through the United Nations. And countries like Canada and around the world signed on to it. Take the Non Proliferation Treaty, which is the most significant treaty in terms of nuclear proliferation and disarmament. It was negotiated and presented at the United Nations by the United States and the Soviet Union, who were the principal who began the negotiation. And then the treaty was drafted and presented to the table of the United Nations, and the people, that is, the member states, voted for it. It requires two-thirds majority for any such treaty to come into effect. It came into effect. It was submitted in 1968, and it came into effect after the country signed on to it. With the required numbers according to the agreement. And as I said, two-thirds to vote, two-thirds to sign. Then the treaty came into effect in 1970. So, for instance, Iran is a member of NPT. And so that lays out the rules of how to go about acquiring nuclear technology, reactors, for peaceful purposes, distinct and separate from weaponizing nuclear knowledge. Um, Iran is a signatory. There were many countries that are not signatories, but more than two-thirds of the countries of the world are signatories. That means they are under NPT agreement. They signed on to it, and then they get the benefit of it. Canada is an NPT signatory. Okay, the country that became nuclear power before the treaty was established, that is in 1968, and came into effect in 1970, are not signatories of the treaty in the sense they're not bound by it because they became a nuclear power, even though they signed on to it, as the United States did, as Soviet Union did. So the countries, United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China became nuclear powers in terms of military weapons before 1968, right? But then there were countries that did not sign on to it, and some of those countries are, for instance, India, Pakistan, North Korea. North Korea developed its own weapon system subsequently. Pakistan developed it. India developed it, but they are not members of the NPT, and so they are not under the NPT investigation. Now, Israel never signed on to it, you know. And yet, Israel is the country that raises all the hassle and hackles about whether it is Iraq, whether it is Iran, and now they're talking about Pakistan, or whether it would be, in some future date, Turkey. But Israel is the country that has broken all the rules. That is the rules that was set up by the United Nations, you see. So, but the Western powers support Israel, because the Western powers are not following international law. They are following their own rules that they have set up. So they have said that no country can have nuclear weapons. And they have targeted Iran, for instance, in this particular instance. Well, India has nuclear weapons. They haven't targeted India. Maybe they will target India. Who knows, They haven't targeted Pakistan, but they may target Pakistan. Again, who knows. So that rule-based order is simply the unilateral. It's like you or I having the power say, this is the rule I'm going to set, and if anybody doesn't follow this rule, we're going to go after them. We're going to punish them. Whereas international law comes out of agreements in which all the parties negotiate at some level, and then it is passed under that international organization. In our world, it is the UN system, which came into being at the end of World War II in 1945. So that's the critical distinction, and I'm happy that you asked for it, to keep in mind, which people, do not understand. So what we discussed last week was, where is Canada when it comes to all the agreements that Canada signed on to and which Canada had been proud about? Peacekeeping, peacemaking, responsibility to protect, etc., right? And they have basically walked away from it, and nobody's holding Canada accountable. Whether one side, Israel, is right, or whether other side, Palestinians, are right, that's beside the point. There's a problem. Where is Canada? Canada is following rule-based order. Why? Because we are signatories to the international law within the United Nations system. Okay. So
Very well.
coming back to, yes, you wanted to say something?
No. Thanks for the keep going. I guess we're talking about going to a multipolar world, and Canada's role in it.
Right. So at the moment there is no multipolar world in the sense that people recognize it. It's still, in some ways, if you're going to, that is the people in the collective West, the G7 countries. We had the G7 conference, last month in Alberta. Um, the G7 countries are engaged in rule-based order. I'll give you just another example. Here we have the G7 conference in Alberta. The members of the G7 some of them are also members of the Security Council, the permanent member, United States, Great Britain, or United Kingdom, France. These are the three countries in the G7 that are permanent members of the Security Council. And they have obligations. And all of the G7 members, except for United States, are signatories of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, right? And they're permanent members of the Security Council. Right? So the ICC court has indicted Benjamin Netanyahu as a war criminal, along with his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant. In other words, he is a criminal until he's proven innocent. And there's a warrant of arrest that was issued by the International Criminal Court that is based in Hague, in Europe. And here is Netanyahu flying about, going to Europe. He went to Greece, which is a signatory of ICC, when the conflict broke out with Iran, the bombing broke out. He's been to France. He's flown over England. He's come repeatedly to America. None of the European countries who are signatories to the ICC say that they're going to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu if Benjamin Netanyahu is flying over the territory or landing in the territory. Now there's a great hoopla going on in America because the candidate for mayor in New York for the Democratic Party and seems to be running with great deal of support, Zohran Mamdani, he's publicly said that if Netanyahu comes to New York, he will have him arrested if he's the mayor.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. So Donald Trump has threatened Mamdani, just as he has threatened the ICC. So where is the rule of law? That is the rule of law, that is international law. That was passed by the International Criminal Court, rule of law that are laws or principles that have been passed. There's resolutions that have been passed by the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, or the rulings that have been given by the International Court of Justice. And you have these European member states who are members of the United Nations, and three of them, or two of them, Britain and France, are members of the Security Council, permanent member, they're blatantly, openly disregarding the law. So what they are following or what they insist upon is rules that they make, which nobody else is part of, getting together to sign and implement. For instance, Japanese have not signed on to it. Vietnamese have not signed on to it. So that's the distinction we are faced with in terms of international politics based upon rule of law. So this breakdown is in fact a feature, not a bug, a feature of the unipolar hegemony that emerged in 1991, 1992. The example of which I was explaining was the Iraq War, 2003. A war that had no authorization of the United Nations Security Council. In the world after 1945, it was agreed, and that's what was written into the UN Charter, that only a war would be legitimate if it has the United Nations decision behind it, approval, authorization behind it. So, for instance, the Korean War was a UN authorized war. However, the Vietnam War was not a UN authorized war, so it was an action of a military power as a rogue state, the United States, committing war crimes for which nobody was held accountable. Well, the Soviet Union also did that. They went into Czechoslovakia, they went into Hungary, they repressed the people, and so those were the breakdown of the international law. They violated the sovereignty and independence of these countries when Soviet Union intervened. And again, the matters were never discussed in the United Nations. So this is the chaos that we are going through. It has broken down. The post-1945 world order has broken down. And there was and is a confusion that we're living through, in which none of the leaders in the collective West is being asked these questions. That we as a country, it is not simply a leader, it is not Mark Carney or before him Justin Trudeau or before him Stephen Harper who is breaking the agreement. It is our country, your country and my country, because the signatures on these documents are in the name of Canada, passed by the Canadian Parliament. So prime ministers may come and go, but the country is there, right? And we are signed on to those agreements. But nobody has stood up and said, why we have broken our agreements. It's not only Canada. Of course, United States, United States considers that its rule, that is its constitution, supersedes the United Nations. Well, it supersedes the United Nations in terms of American law within the American territory. But internationally, it cannot supersede it because America is a signatory to the United Nations. That's why America is sitting there as a permanent member, vetoing resolutions of the Security Council. You see? But there's no explanation. It's simply might is right. So that's where we are. But something else has happened as a result of all of this chaos that has taken place, and these powerful, the most powerful countries in the world, that is the G7 countries, both economically, technologically, and of course militarily, uh, imposing their rule-based order, as was in Iraq, as has been continually in West Asia on the question of Palestine, because the conduct and behavior of Israel, going all the way back to 1948 and through to now, with all the many wars and the resolutions passed in the Security Council and the rulings of the International Court of Justice, Israel has been in violation of all the laws, all the rules, all the resolution, all the norms, but it is fully protected and shielded by America and the collective West, the G7 countries, has been until now. And until now, there is a there is an emergent uh, basis of opposition to this unipolar hegemony that came into being in 1991, 1992. And that is the rise of the BRICS nation. And the rise of the BRICS nation, BRICS standing for BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. These were the initial countries that came together, and now it is expanding. Uh, so when they came together to sit and talk among themselves at the UN, it, it came together in 2006. The foreign ministers of these countries came together to talk about common interests and common issues in matters of international politics, international economics, trade, technology, and developmental issues. So that 2006 coming together in a totally different climate from where we are today, 20 years later, that was not paid attention to. So it was like in the UN, there are different, segments of countries that have their club and they get together and talk. For instance, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council in the Persian Gulf, the Arab League states, the ASEAN state, you know, that is the Southeast Asian nations, or OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, 57 member states, that is the Muslim majority states within the UN. So these are clubs. So BRICS was seen just as another club, getting together and talking, the foreign ministers. But in 2009, it was not simply the foreign ministers, it was the heads of states of these countries met for the first time in what came to be called the BRICS Summit. And it was still roughly 5 countries. But between 2009 and 2024, the countries expanded. They had the rules, the mechanism, and it expanded. And at the end of 2024, there were 10 member states of BRICS. They expanded from the countries that I have mentioned, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the following countries became members according to the rules that they had set up, BRICS had set up. Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. They became officially members of the BRICS. In 2025, what they had agreed to in 2009, that they would have annual meetings, the heads of the BRICS states, the founding states. So in 2025, in the meeting just concluded, the summit just concluded in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, 11 new members became partners of BRICS, which is the initial step to becoming full members. And so the numbers have expanded. Now 10 full members, 11 partners that will probably become full members in the next summit. And just for your audience, let me read the list of the names that were added at the end of the summit that happened last month in Brazil: Belarus, Bolivia, Kazakhstan, Cuba, Indonesia, Nigeria, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Uganda, and Uzbekistan. All right. So, what is happening is BRICS nation and its membership, and they're all members of the United Nations, is rapidly expanding, and it is expanding in the global south. You know, formerly countries that were colonies of European imperialism and colonialism: Great Britain, France, Holland, and so on and so forth. Spain, Portugal, and this is expanding. From my perspective, looking back at it historically, it is a repeat taking place at the height of the Cold War in the 1960s and 70s, when the non-aligned movement came together, which was a movement, again, of countries at that time called the third world countries, that came together to say we are neither going to be taken for granted by the Western powers, that's led by United States, or by Soviet Union, the Eastern powers. We are non-aligned. We are neutral countries. We want connection with everybody because our priorities is development, and we don't belong to this bipolar world that is in a conflict situation. And that ended, non-aligned movement, in a sense, ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And now it seems to me that BRICS is resurfacing as a block of countries which will very soon become a majority, as more and more African members, more and more South American members, and of course Asian members become member states of BRICS officially. And it will take on the color, the reality of what people had been anticipating. That is the emergence of a multipolar world. But if I just take a moment here, because I've been talking a lot and I don't want to engage in a monologue, point out there's the G7 countries, and none of the G7 countries are from the global south, even though Japan is not a European country or a North American country, but Japan, as an economic power, is a member of G7, and as an ally and a satellite of the United States, is a G7 country. But the rest of them, the G6, they're all European states, including Canada and United States. Um, France, Britain, Germany, Italy, then Canada, United States, and Japan. Now, the G7 countries, in comparison to the BRICS, because BRICS, as I said, is a 10-member country partners, and now 11 members have been added this year as partners, and they will next year will be a bigger country. But just take G10, G7, and G10. The BRICS country, the 10, together constitute 55% of the world population. Its GDP, that's gross domestic product, in terms of nominal GDP, is 30% of the global GDP. But if GDP is calculated on real term, which is called the PPP, that is purchasing power parity, then the BRICS country, the 10-member BRIC country together constitute 45% of the global GDP calculated on the basis of PPP. Whereas the G7 countries, they calculate basically 30% of the global GDP based on PPP. In other words, the BRICS nation already surpass, both in terms of population and in terms of GDP, the GDP and population of the G7 countries. See, a shift is taking place. With that shift will come all the other shifts: banking, finance, trade, and so on and so forth. In other words, the G7 countries, led by the United States, will not be in a position to impose upon the BRICS countries their priorities or their methods of operation. For instance, SWIFT, dollar or petrodollar as the reserve currency of the world. At this moment in time, international trade takes place through US dollar as the reserve currency. Every country that trades with another country buys and sells their commodities, their manufactures through US dollar. In other words, country A has to have in its account US dollar to buy from country B whatever it is seeking to buy from country B, and vice versa. The B has to have US dollar account to buy things from country A. You see? So the global currency is the US dollar. You see? And SWIFT was the mechanism of converting these money and transferring these money in the world among all the countries of the world engage in trading with each other.
Professor, I'm gonna before getting to BRICS, I'm gonna ask a question,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna answer it myself, and then you tell me what your view is. So the question is: since 1991, roughly, when we went to the unipolar world, how did the West, led by the U.S., squander their lead so badly? And what I'm thinking is, you had the debacle in Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years. You had the great financial crash. So both of those are mismanaging. You're mismanaging people's money. After 2009/11, you also had a weaponization of the monetary system, specifically against Iran, but we saw it back in 2022 against Russia. So it seems like the West got too arrogant, and it made a couple of mistakes where they couldn't create this perfect trap system where they trap the global South. And the global South is, as you mentioned, the non-aligned countries are now basically manifesting as BRICS. What are your views on what I just said? What can you add to that?
Um, the short, quick answer is that in retrospect, you might argue that it was a miscalculation, which is what you have assumed. But in the context of the unipolar world that emerged after 1991, it was not a miscalculation, it was a feature. You see, um, the collective West, led by the United States, was going to dominate and impose upon the rest of the world. Uh, Maybe impose is the wrong word, carry on with what was their dominant position in 1991. Nobody in the world was challenging the G7 countries or challenging the United States, not even Russia, you see, that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, not China. In 1991, China was not what China is now, 30 plus years later. You see, 30 plus years later, China is now an economy, if you go by the nominal GDP, second to the United States. But if you go by the GDP by the PPP calculation, purchasing power parity calculation, which, by the way, the World Bank does, the IMF does. These are all institutions and instruments that was part of the UN system that was built in 1945. And according to the PPP calculation, China is today the world's largest economy, larger than the United States. It was not so in 1991. Okay. Um, but the United States and the G7 countries simply made the assumption that they will not be challenged, that there would be no change in that hierarchy of power. That's the meaning of unipolarity. There's only one pole, and the pole is the Eurocentric world, which is dominated by the Anglo-American power, United States, with Britain as its secondary supporting system. Britain was the number one power before 1945, and then after 1945, United States emerged, and in collaboration with Britain, they imposed the decision on the rest of the world. Um, so, how the relevant question in your statement is, how did this happen and why did this happen? And how and the why is connected to, in a very straightforward way, the bullying done by the Western powers to those countries that said, no, we don't want to go by this route. We don't want to accept this. And so we see the phenomena emerging after 1991, which had existed before, but now it became even more gratuitous. That is, bringing about regime change. The 2003 war in Iraq was a regime change war. It had no UN authorization. There was no basis of taking out the Saddam Hussein regime, whatever might be the opinion of the United States or Britain or whoever. It didn't have any basis because that's a sovereign independent country. There are ways to deal with those challenges that Iraq posed through the United Nations. You know, but that regime change operation in 2003 has been followed elsewhere. It has been followed in Libya. It has been followed in Yugoslavia, after the breakup of Yugoslavia, and other countries, you the war in Iran, with Iran last month, was a regime change operation that for the moment failed, but they haven't given it up. Iran, instead, ironically, was the first country after 1945 where regime change operation was done by the Anglo-American power, that is a CIA MI6 operation that overthrew an elected Iranian government of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 and imposed upon the Iranian people the Pahlavi regime. And the history of the Pahlavi regime between 1953, which was imposed upon Iran by a coup d'etat that removed and imprisoned Mohammad Mossadegh, the leader of Iran, he was the prime minister, uh, and imposed upon the Iranian people in 53, that then overthrown by an Iranian revolution of 79. So this entire period has been erased from the memory of the American people or people in Canada. That is, history of Iran begins in 1979. It's absurd, but that's what it is. Or like what has happened in Ukraine. A regime change operation took place in 2014 in the Maidan coup d'etat in Ukraine. But the people in Canada, that is the government, don't talk about that. They talk about that the whole problem began when Russia moved into the Donbass region on the basis of Article 51 of the United Nations Charter and SMO, which is part of the R2P, responsibility to protect, what was happening in the Donbass region. You see, so it is this uh, uh, use of sanction, use of regime change operation that led to the beginning of the resistance, which
Professor,
now has, yeah.
can you, again, for the audience, can you describe what R2P is?
R2P is responsibility to protect. That is the policy that was adopted by the UN. It had the imprint of Canada in a very, very important sense, because it was the Prime Minister of Canada, Jean Chrétien, that took up the challenge and the request made by Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, following the Rwanda genocide and the conflicts in the Balkans, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Croatia, and then later on in Serbia with the Kosovo situation. The challenge was, how do um, uh, the United Nations, on what basis can the United Nations or any country, because when the United Nations goes into operation, it asks the member states to provide the support, the resources, because the United Nations does not have a standing army. How would United Nations intervene in the internal conflict um, of an independent, sovereign member state of the United Nations? That's had been a dilemma in many other similar conflicts of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, like in Cambodia, like in Uganda, like in East Pakistan, Bangladesh now. There were genocide in these places, and there was no intervention. So, or intervention took place by the neighboring country acting unilaterally in defense of the people and going in to remove the regime that was engaging in genocide or human rights violation, as in the case of, say, Idi Amin in Uganda and Mobutu of, I think it was Mobutu, no, sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the president of Tanzania at this moment. But the Tanzanian army was sent into Uganda, and Idi Amin's regime was defeated. Idi Amin fled, and the people of Uganda, in that sense, was saved from the human rights violation that was taking place over there. Uh, Zohran Mamdani's family is from Uganda. They are of South Asian background, Indian background, but they were in Uganda. And so they had to flee, and they fled to America. And now Zohran, who grew up in America, is running for the mayor of New York. And so he knows what happened, you know. So R2P is now part of the UN Charter. Canada contributed to it, and the policy was presented to the UN at the UN Summit, World Summit in 2005, and it was adopted. So that's responsibility to protect. For instance, what is happening in Gaza, no country in the world who has an influence in that part of the world has come forward and say, you know, we are going to send in a military force to stop the genocide. That is responsibility to protect the unarmed people, especially children and women in Gaza, who are being massacred as they are fish in a barrel, right? No country. But there are countries who have supported the people by trying to interdict and put pressure on Israel. For instance, the Houthi, they have been, attacking Israel with long-range missiles over the last 2 days or 3 days. They sunk, the Houthis sunk two ships in the Red Sea that was headed for Israel, the port Eilat. So what is happening is the Houthis, or what were the Hezbollah, Iran were doing, they were trying to, interdict ships, planes flying into Israel, so that they could bring pressure on Israel to stop the genocide. So that's where we are. We have the rules, we have the laws. That is the international rules, law based upon UN Charter, that is being violated. By who? By the founding member of the United Nations, United States, Britain. Canada, France. You see, so these countries, the BRICS that came together, were concerned about these things, and so they started putting, their own group together to counter this rule-based order that was in effect going about sanctioning and doing punitive politics against countries that were not seen to be following the rules being set by America. You see, and that formation, this is part of the answer to your question, came to a head on in the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war and the Gaza war and the situation in Africa, these are not completely separate, though they're happening in different time frames. But this is all happening after 2006, 2009. So the Ukraine war, the proxy war in Ukraine that was launched after the coup d'etat of 2014, was launched on the assumption by the Americans and their partners, the European Union, with NATO as the force, on the assumption that pressure brought upon Russia, military pressure brought upon Russia through Ukraine. And what was the issue of Ukraine? That Ukraine will become a member state of the NATO. Ukraine is not a member state of the NATO, but the whole situation of advancing countries in Eastern Europe on the borders of former Soviet Union, now Russia, being brought into the UN, into NATO, as a threat to Russia, and Ukraine being the most proximate country to be invited to join NATO. And if there is military resistance by Russia, then a proxy war in Ukraine would lead to a swift breakdown of the regime in Moscow, the Putin government in Moscow. It was not simply a military action. It is going to be, a all-purpose sanction against Russia. Russia taken out of the SWIFT system, in terms of trade and so on, and the sovereign wealth of Russia that was in deposit in Western banks seized and taken away. So that was a multifaceted proposition that was executed when the coup d'état took place, and the regime in Kiev, which was basically an anti-Russian regime, because Yanukovych came from that part of Ukraine which was Russian-speaking. So this anti-Russian regime supporting, the Banderista group, which is our at that time deputy prime minister, who became deputy Chrystia Freeland is connected with. Stephen Bandera, which is basically a Nazi organization that had collaborated with the Nazis during the Second World War. Chrystia Freeland's grandfather was a member of that organization. So this Nazi operation, Zelensky government is supported by the Ukrainian Nazis, the Azov battalion, engage in killings and destruction of the people in the Donbass region. In Donetsk.
Sorry, just from my understanding, the word Nazi in Ukraine, you could replace it with terrorist, and the word denazification, you could replace it with counterterrorism. Is that accurate?
You are right, but the Russian used the term Nazis because the Banderista groups were allied with and participated with the Nazis in the Second World War. The guy you saw sitting in the parliament, who was introduced by the Speaker of the House as a Canadian hero, was a member of the Waffen SS, a Ukrainian Canadian. That 338 members of the Canadian Parliament stood up and saluted and cheered in September of 2023. Since when did a Waffen SS member become a Canadian hero? It becomes a Canadian hero in the history that is being narrated post 1991 in the rule based order.
Yeah, but we're not. So you mentioned rules-based order. We don't have rule of law anymore. I mean, look at Syria. You have ISIS terrorists running a country. So this is, I don't know what's going on. We are rapidly moving away from international or any form of law.
Well, we don't have law anymore. That's the whole point. The unipolar hegemony led to the stripping down away of international law from the perspective that all laws in the international arena will be based upon the UN system. America has violated that openly. America is a rogue state. America calls everybody else a rogue state, but yet America is the leading rogue state. Israel is a leading terrorist state. Once you get into the history of these things, I mean, the prime ministers of Israel were wanted terrorists. Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, and others. And today it is, at the present, it is Benjamin Netanyahu. So what has happened in Syria with the overthrow of the previous regime of Bashar al-Assad and the Ba'ath Party by this group of people who were members of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra, that is, the radical extreme Muslim terrorist group, head choppers, whether they were in Afghanistan, the Taliban, or in the Middle East or elsewhere. Now we can see that they were all financed by the CIA, the MI6, and Mossad. They were using the cover of Islam for their terrorist activity. Those of us who wrote about that and against that were marginalized and deplatformed. So this man, Al-Jolani, is now embraced by Donald Trump as what a good man he is, what a brave man he is. He was a brave man doing the head chopping of people who oppose the Muslim Brotherhood and the radical Islamists, in whether it was in Syria, whether it was in Lebanon, whether it was in Pakistan, whether it was Afghanistan, Nigeria, Libya, on and on and on. But this was, again, just as the Stephen Bandera Nazis in Ukraine was financed after the end of the Second World War by the CIA. And just as the German Nazi, senior members of the German Nazi in the army, in the administration, among the academics, that is the scientists, many of them were smuggled out of Europe and brought to America. So that is the dark history that has now come to the surface. You see, and we're faced with, as you say, the absence of law. Yes, it is a two-tier system. There's the rule-based order, which is the rules that America and its allies set up, and then there is the international law. The irony is that the UN is now being defended by the countries during the Cold War who were opposed to America or the Western world, apart from the countries of the global South who tried to be non-aligned countries like India, countries like Egypt. They were non-aligned. They didn't want to be members of the either side. So now BRICS doesn't, for BRICS, it is the UN system. They want to hold on to the UN system and expand the UN system and impose the US system, while the Americans and the G7 and the collective West has been engaged in, at least since 1991, but I can trace it back to even before that, to smear and slander the UN, because the UN, the majority of the members in the UN, as the decolonization process began after World War II, the members increased from the global south. You see? So in 1945-46, which in the case of Israel and Palestine, that is the Palestine Mandate, the membership was limited to basically the European countries and those independent countries in South America and a few independent countries outside of Europe and South America in the global south, countries like Saudi Arabia, that was independent technically before 1945, or Iraq or Turkey. So they were there. But the majority were the European members, and they voted for the establishment of the state of Palestine by dividing up the Palestine Mandate in 1948. Right now, if that situation had been different in terms of membership, that vote would not have gone through. So Israel gets established by the vote in the UN. Israel did not get established by what God spoke to Abraham 3,500 years ago. You know, that God said to Abraham, I give you this land in perpetuity, you know, to the chosen people. No, Israel was established through the UN with the support of the United States and the Soviet Union. But then afterward, Israel and the Americans started attacking the UN because the UN, as the numbers increased, were insisting upon the rule of law based on UN Charter. And so the defamation of the UN began. It was Ronald Reagan in the 1980s who said UN should get out of New York. So it's a very complex history, and history is not known. What is known is narrative of powerful people through the media. So coming back to where we are on the question of the emerging multipolar world, the war against Russia backfired.
Yeah.
Russia, to put it very mildly, Russia was not a country like Libya, like Iraq. However desperate Russia might have been in 1991, Russia was still a military superpower, a nuclear superpower. So the war that began, the special military operation that began, countered by the Western powers, the United States and the European Union with NATO, in February 2024, the Americans and their partners thought it would be a matter of just a little more pressure, and yes, Russia will crack.
What was that World War One quote? 2 weeks to Berlin, and then the war took 4 years.
Exactly. We will go for the summer and then it will be all over. We'll come back home. But by the end of the war, 4 years later, 5 of the empires that engaged in the war, 3 were gone: Germany, Austro-Hungarian, and Tsarist Russia. The only 2 empires that remained much weakened was Britain and France. And after Second World War, they also went. So that is the miscalculation. But it was not a miscalculation that was understood at that time. It was in retrospect. That misfired, having misfired, other countries were watching it. And therefore, BRICS started emerging. The other thing that happened was in 1971, and then Nixon going to China in 1972, the Americans were able to engage with the Chinese, that is Mao Zedong, the founder of modern China, and his party, uh, that established the revolution in 1949 and went forward. In 72, Nixon, by going to China, established relationship with China and opened up a breach between China and the Soviet Union, two communist power. You know, so the triangulation, and that was very successful. And so, as a consequence of that, you know, America was able to put a lot of pressure, political pressure, on Soviet Union. And the long and the short of it is the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed. Right? Russia and China, or Soviet Union and China, were on opposite end. They were hostile to each other. But the Ukraine situation brought China and Russia together. Why? Because the Americans' rule-based order was also threatening the Chinese.
I would say even before then, when the the sanctioning of Russia during the Ukraine war, I think that really started pushing Russia towards China. But
Yeah,
definitely the Ukraine war. Yeah.
yeah, ultimately the Ukraine war, as it went on, basically fused the two back together again. You see, and in that larger context of history and the theory about that, that is the Eurasian landmass, which is the heartland of the world. It was a theory that was developed by the British geographer Halford Mackinder in the early 20th century. And the theory is that, whoever controls the Eurasian landmass will therefore control the rest of the world. Yes. So if you look at the map, you know, Russia stretches across the northern half of Asia into Europe, and then you add China to that. This is the heartland, you see. And according to McCandless, the rest of the world is island. So who is in control of the heartland will control the rest of the world. And the British, as an empire, before World War One, and then through the 20th century history, have been committed in some way or the other to dismantle the heartland, that is, to dismantle the Soviet Union. First, Russia, the Tsarist Empire, then the Soviet Union, and now Russia. This has been the strategic interest. And America is joined together with that interest, But there is the other element, which I haven't put on the table. And the other element is that all these wars, if you go on to go back to the rise of the Eurocentric world, um, that is, the European powers dominating the world, in which the Britain became the largest empire. So we go back 300 years, 400 years, you might want to go back to, or all the way back to 1492, the Columbus journey, that is often seen by historians as the birth of the Eurocentric world. Um, Europe has been uh, pushing forward, looking for and acquiring the natural resource wealth outside of Europe. Europe doesn't have the natural resource wealth that the global South has, or North America and Latin America together have. So the resources are in the global South. For instance, the Middle East, the fossil fuel, you know, as one, and that has been the basis of the wars that has come to the Middle East, both in World War One and World War Two, when the British Navy, the navy of the greatest empire at that time, um, switched from coal-firing naval ships to petroleum-firing naval ship. That happened just before World War One, under the command of Churchill, who was the first Lord of the Admiralty before World War One, the switch took place because it was again the oil that was discovered. Or it wasn't discovered, it was there, but it was exploited and taken control of by Britain in the Persian Gulf region, including Iran, you know. And that history played out over the next 50 years when Iran elected Mossadegh as the prime minister, who nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, that is the British Oil Company. Um, it is about resource. And so the BRICS nation and the struggle now between the BRICS nation as an emerging multipolar world and the global north, by which we mean the G7 countries, the collective West, they want to continue controlling the global resources. You see, I have a chart in front of me. Um, Here, I'll hold it up here, and I'll just read it to you. The, this is uh, from the again the American sources, World Bank, CIA, etc. Their compilation, uh, the natural resources values of countries in the world. So the top 10 countries, won't go into all the countries, but the top 10 countries, the number 1 to 10. The top 10 countries are Russia, United States. This is in terms of natural resources of the country. Russia, number 2 is United States, number 3 is Saudi Arabia, number 4 is Canada, number 5 is Iran, number 6 is China, number 7 is Brazil, number 8 is Australia, number 9 is Iraq, and number 10 is Venezuela. The interesting thing is, of these 10 countries, only 3 are of the global north, the G7: United States, Canada, and Australia is not a member of G7, but it's taken part of
I
the
was
Anglo.
laughing. I'm like, what the hell does Australia have? Sand and drunk surfers.
Well, it has resources, the rare earth material and cobalt and potash and so on and so forth. So it does have, So, I mean, if the list I read of 150 countries, it's all broken up. But here it is. Russia is the number one country in terms of natural resources. So all of it, oil, lumber, rare earth material, and so on and so forth. Russia has it. Gold, precious metals, you know. Number three country is Saudi Arabia. Of course it is. Oil, you know. Number five country is Iran. Oil. But Iran also, and so as Saudi Arabia, has mineral wealth that has to be exploited. Iran has the largest natural gas resource, supply or availability apart from oil. China, for instance, the almost 85% of rare earth material comes from China, and almost 90% and over is processed in China. So whatever rare earth material is found in America is sent to China for processing, because America doesn't have the manufacturing and processing plants in America. So this is a resource war also, and the whole emergence of multipolarity that is taking shape, a multipolar world that is taking place, in one word can be defined as this is the actual decolonization taking place. Because what happened in 1945 and after the decolonization that took place, India became independent, for instance, and so on and so forth, Indochina and other countries, Algeria, African countries, they became independent or went through decolonization, but it was only nominally, in name only, because what happened, the formal colonial powers backed away from direct control, and we ended up in a neo-colonial system. So it was an indirect colonialism, what in the economic literature is called dependency. Brazil, Venezuela, and all the countries that I've listed, their resources were still controlled. Their resources were manufactured by conglomerates whose shareholders and power were all based in the collective north. You see, so the emergence of multipolar world is the actual decolonization taking place, in which the neo-colonial relationship is going to be ended, and these countries are going to be taking over their own resources. That is the fight that is taking place or has taken place. Why is Gaza being, destroyed? A genocide taking place in front of the world, and nobody is interfering. That is the collective West that has the instrument to interfere, not interfering, because the mineral resources, the oil and gas resources of the offshore availability along the Gaza Strip is massive. Palestinians can emerge as a wealthy country if Palestine becomes an independent state based upon UN resolution. But that's not what Israel wants or will allow until it is forced to or it is defeated. See, the resources, the offshore resources in the Mediterranean, on the land, along the sovereign area that is part of Gaza, uh, part of Lebanon, and so on. Israel wants to take it over. And not only Israel, that is, Israel is simply the cat's paw of the collective West of America.
Well, now we have Turkey as well meddling in the Middle East.
Yeah, well, Trump says that he wants to build a Riviera in Gaza over the bones and blood of the children who have been killed and massacred. So, to pull it all together, we are going through this immense chaos and challenge. Okay. And what is happening is we are witnessing the rupture between the unipolar world and a multipolar world is taking shape right in front of our eyes. The Americans insist, and Trump has threatened any country that engages in trade based upon bilateral currency and not the dollar, that he is going to sanction them. He's going to impose tariff on them. And those are threats that leads to regime change operation. But that's exactly what is going to happen and is happening. The Chinese and the Russians and the Indians and the Brazilians are all coming together to create an alternative to the petrodollar. And the irony is, the Saudi Arabia has joined the BRICS. We say it is petrodollars because after the 1973 oil price quadrupling that took place in the context of the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, October 1973, following that war, the quadrupling of the prices, America negotiated with the Saudis. Negotiated meaning insisted upon. Saudi Arabia was within the shelter of American power relationship. And this is the time of the Cold War. Nixon was the president. Nixon had taken America out of the gold standard in 1971 in the midst of the Vietnam War. And so he negotiated with Nixon Kissinger, with the Saudis, that all of the sales of oil will take place through the American reserve currency dollar. Of course, Iran was also involved in that because Iran was a member of OPEC, and the king, the Shah, was an American puppet. Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two major OPEC countries, came to an agreement that all trade of the natural resources of these two countries, and then the of the OPEC would take place through the U.S. reserve currency. That's the birth of petrodollar. All right. Well, now they're shifting away. Indeed, the Chinese and the Russians and the Malaysians and the Indonesians, they have begun trading bilaterally based upon their own currencies until an alternative currency is established.
Professor Mansour, so you got the BRICS that's rising up. You got a multipolar world. You were moving to de-dollarization. The U.S. economy, I think it went from 60% of global economy to now it's like 24%.
Mhm.
What's the future of NATO?
The future of NATO will, of course, depend upon the European and the Americans. But what we can see, I mean, there is a pressure that has been building up within America, forget about other countries, that NATO is an obsolete agreement. NATO was created during the Cold War confrontation between the Soviet Union in 1949, to which Canada became a member under the government of Louis Saint Laurent and the Foreign Minister Lester Pearson, who played a very instrumental role in writing up the treaty. That when the Cold War ended, NATO should have been disbanded, just as the Warsaw Pact was disbanded, which was the Soviet side treaty, military treaty, should have been disbanded. But instead of disbanding it, the Clinton administration began advancing NATO into uh, Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact countries, ultimately to Ukraine. That led to all that has happened ever since. So one view is that NATO will come to an end. It will be it possibly after the Ukraine war is over. The Russian army eventually brings about a complete capitulation of Ukraine. That is only a matter of time. Um, the NATO alliance will break down. That is foreseeable. The other thing is that the European countries, that is the EU members, might still want to cling to the idea of NATO, whether America participates or not, cling to the idea for um, uh, having a united European military presence against, you need an enemy. So Russia will remain the enemy of Europe or rest of Europe for the time being. So that is again up in the air. The logic of NATO basically crashed after the end of the Cold War. The more pertinent question is, what about Canada? Why has Canada gone around investing uh, our resources, our scarce resources, you might say? We are deep in debt and in deficit um, into this Ukraine war. What was Canada's national interest? It was not an Article 5 issue of the NATO treaty. The Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which is the most pertinent article, says if one member of NATO is attacked, then all members of NATO will come into the defense of that one member. That is collective defense. Well, Ukraine is not a member state, so why is Canada in there? That debate has not taken place. Nobody has stood up and spoken out about it. Lester Pearson was very clear about this matter. He did not know. I mean, we're going back now 70 plus years. But in 1949, when the treaty was being written and drafted and then voted upon and membership established, Article 2 of the treaty, NATO treaty, is called the Canadian article because that is Lester Pearson's article. And that article called upon NATO not only for military purposes, but for diplomatic purposes. That NATO will not simply be a military organization or military arrangement, security arrangement. It will also be for diplomacy, to represent the collective West in terms of diplomacy with the others who are not members of the organization. Well, Canada should have picked up on Article 2 and stepped up to say, we are not going to be militarily involved in it, but we will put our resources behind the negotiation for a settlement of this conflict. You know, Turkey, which is a member of NATO, and a more important member of NATO than Canada, in terms of Canada doesn't have any military officially in Europe, because the last of Canadian armed forces were withdrawn from Europe at the end of Mulroney's term in office in 1993, because the Cold War was over and Mulroney brought back the deployment of Canadian forces in Europe. Um, Turkey is a very important member because Turkey is got the second largest military force in NATO after United States. Well, when the war began or the military operation began, Turkey offered its services to bring about Ukraine and Russia to negotiate. And negotiation took place. An agreement was reached, which was torpedoed by the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, Boris Johnson.
Yeah. I can't trust Johnson, but I also can't trust Erdogan. That guy is always a loose cannon.
Yeah, but we're talking about serious matter of war and peace in Turkey, instead of going gung ho and joining Ukraine or sending troops into Ukraine, did not and has not. You know, Hungary is a member of NATO. Hungary has not. So the question is, why has Canada? And Canada is such a strategically placed location in terms of being the buffer state between United States and Russia, that if a conflict breaks out due to escalation between the United States and Russia over Ukraine to a nuclear level, the missiles will be flying over Canadian territory. None of these things have been talked about. So yeah, I mean, in more ways than one can argue, NATO is an obsolescent, but it is there because it served the interests of the military-industrial complex, the never-ending wars, the forever wars. You know, the American cities are collapsing, the American infrastructures are collapsing, but there is hundreds of billions of dollars that is being spent on weapons sent to Ukraine or to Israel.
So, Professor, this was this was actually a fascinating episode. I have to go soon. I gotta go to a haircut. A couple of things. It's getting out of control. A couple of things I wanted to mention. One, I keep looking at the comments. There is really lively debate on both sides. People that agree with you and disagree, and it's really I'm really proud to see that Canadians are taking an interest. And you're right. This should be happening in the Parliament. One thing that Sue Kellen Dyer brought up, that just it's a point of clarification. Saudi Arabia hasn't actually fully joined BRICS. I believe they're in talks to join BRICS. That is that correct?
For my information, Saudi Arabia became a member of BRICS prior to 2024. And so Saudi Arabia was participating in the BRICS summit. And that is according to the list that is available. Now, if whoever is making that point has alternative information, then we need to talk about that, or I need to know what is.
It's okay. I think they're just there's different, like it's a member, right? Like they've been invited to join, but I don't know. I tried looking for it right now. I couldn't find it either.
No. The way this thing has evolved, and of course this is evolving. It began in 2006, and it is going to grow. The countries are either invited, or the countries submit an interest, an application to become a formal member of BRICS, and so they go through the process. One process is that they are taken in as partners, and I read you the names of the partners that have already been established and acknowledged. They will become, after a waiting period, so the waiting period is between their application and the next summit, to become a full member. And so, yeah, and they don't want to expand too fast, because expanding too fast means there can be also importing too many problems. For instance, Pakistan has put in its application and is waiting to be invited. There are other countries that have put up their application and they're waiting to be brought in. But I think about Saudi Arabia. Not I think, I know about Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, of course, Iran, these have all become full members. They're all full members.
All right, so I guess Professor Mansour will hopefully we'll get you back next week, same time, same channel, and
Oh, okay.
if anybody, if the audience has any suggestions for what you want us to cover, you can put a comment in the
Where
description
where
of the
where
video.
where are you seeing the comments? I mean, I can't
Oh,
see.
you can't see them, but I can bring them up like this. I guess you can't see them on your side.
No, no, I don't see them.
It's the power that I have. Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay, okay.
So, Professor Mansour, thank you very much. You've been very gracious with your time, and I enjoyed this conversation, and I think the audience did as well. So, thank you so much.
Well, my final comment for this discussion is yes, of course, there is going to be dispute and disagreements and view, because we are sitting in the global north. We are not sitting in the global south. In the global south, there is a entirely different thinking and perspective on this matter. And so, in the questions, say, on the conflict in West Asia and the genocide in West Asia, the global south has a wholly different perspective than the perspective of people in Canada, especially in Western Canada, where Christian Zionists are dominant factor. You know, so this is, but again, just to conclude, I don't want to take your time from your haircut, but just make the final point. The ledger poll that came out in the middle of June, asking the question, where do Canadians stand on the question of genocide and their relationship with Israel, or the support or opposition to Israel? The result was the country is divided. 49% was against the genocide and against Israel. 50% was okay with the genocide and for Israel. 49-40. My opinion is that if you slice those numbers, the heavy support, 50 is hardly any difference between 49-50, but the support among the 50, the largest body of supporters would be in Western Canada, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, which is where you have the largest number of Christian Zionists. It would not be in Ontario, it would not be in Quebec. You see? So it is divided. Same thing it is in America, same thing in Great Britain. Anyhow, this is the conversation that has to continue, but it is up to our members in parliament and our political leaders and others to come out and explain their position, and they haven't. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I got to run. Thanks to the audience. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Professor. Have a wonderful day.
You too. All the best.